Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material on the resolution under consideration.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The House will be in order. The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the United States is not at war with Syria. Rather, the United States is conducting limited but important counterterrorism operations in Syria against ISIS, formerly known as al-Qaeda in Iraq, pursuant to the 2001 counterterrorism AUMF. Those operations are being reported regularly to Congress, consistent with the War Powers Resolution. They are not new or unique to the Biden administration. In fact, let me quote President Trump about what we are doing here, when he said, quote, "A small presence of United States Armed Forces remains in strategically significant locations in Syria to conduct operations against continuing terrorist threats emanating from Syria. These ongoing operations, which the United States has carried out with the assistance of numerous international partners, has been successful in seriously degrading ISIS capabilities in Syria and Iraq," end of quote. When ISIS was at the peak of its power in 2015, it controlled vast territory in Iraq and Syria, which it used to launch attacks in the Middle East and beyond. Those terrorists ruled with medieval brutality, and we all remember the graphic videos of ISIS fighters beheading journalists and innocent civilians. These monsters drew thousands of foreign volunteers to join their ranks in Iraq and Syria and inspired terrorist attacks around the world. Our U.S. military, working with a global coalition and local forces on the ground, helped to dismantle and destroy this vicious caliphate. I'm proud that our men and women in uniform answered the call to fight this menace, which threatened the United States and the world. And even though ISIS no longer controls significant territory, there are still tens of thousands of hardened terrorist fighters in Iraq and Syria who are hell-bent on reestablishing their terror state. In fact, in the last quarter of 2022, ISIS claimed 72 attacks in Iraq and Syria, including several IED attacks. Thankfully, our small deployment of U.S. service members is remarkably effective at working with local partners to achieve results and ensure the enduring and complete defeat of ISIS. Otherwise, these numbers would be much worse. In 2022, we were involved in 108 partner and 14 unilateral operations, killing 466 ISIS operatives and detaining 250 others. None of us want our soldiers overseas and in harm's way any longer than is absolutely necessary. And I understand that the gentleman from Florida has introduced this resolution in good faith and in well-intentioned. And he did it in response to a February 17 operation to kill an ISIS leader in which 4 U.S. service members were wounded. Any injured or killed service member is a tragedy. We are eternally grateful for their sacrifices, the sacrifices made by our men and women in uniform and their families, and never take them for granted. And it's our responsibility as members of Congress to reassess an ongoing basis whether their deployments and the risks they involve are necessary. In doing that, we must recall President Obama's disastrous decision to prematurely withdraw our troops from Iraq in 2011. A few years later, American troops returned to fight the deadly ISIS caliphate, which grew out of the al-Qaeda presence that had not been defeated. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, was in Syria just days ago to see our troops and assess the state of our mission. He went there to figure out what value this mission holds for our security. He said, and I quote, "Unless you support and devote the correct amount of resources to it, things will get worse, and if you completely ignore and turn your back, then you're setting the conditions for a resurgence." That is why I strongly oppose this resolution directing the removal of United States Armed Forces from Syria, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. If we withdraw our troops from Syria now, we could see a resurgence of ISIS or another legal successor in short time. Withdrawal of this legal authorized U.S. troop deployment must be based on the total defeat of ISIS. Let me be clear, Congress's power to declare war is one of our most solemn Article I responsibilities. And I understand why some in this chamber are uncomfortable with using a 22-year-old force authorization for current operations. I believe that we should be working together in a bipartisan manner to have an updated replacement to this AUMF to address the current threat environment, while also keeping Congress engaged with our constitutional responsibilities. But this resolution does not work to that end. I believe it would call for an artificial withdrawal, and it would be a win for the ISIS terrorists committed to our destruction. The bottom line is, the premise upon this resolution, as a parliamentarian doesn't make fact-based determinations, the premise of this whole thing is that there's no authorization for troops to be in Syria today. It's just not accurate. In fact, it's wrong, because in 2014, the ISIS threat was addressed under presidential authorities of 2001 AUMF, and I remember being in the White House with President Trump addressing this crisis as well, about what to do about Syria and whether we believe our U.S. troops should remain in a very small footprint of 900 soldiers in Syria. And at that time, President Trump made the decision that under the 2001 AUMF to keep these troops in country, and I believe that was a correct decision, and I stand by that, and I urge my colleagues to join me in this opposition, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may use.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in opposition to House Concurrent Resolution 21. And Mr. Speaker, though I oppose an indefinite U.S. military presence in Syria, this measure forces a premature end to our mission at a critical time for our efforts. Forcing such a premature removal of U.S. forces not only endangers our national security, it threatens that of our allies and partners across the region and beyond, and most of all, the Syrian Kurds. Our very small footprint in northeast Syria, alongside our courageous Syrian Kurdish partners, continues to serve a valuable purpose as we partner with them in ensuring ISIS does not reconstitute and again destabilize the region or use Syria as a base for attacks elsewhere. We have seen how ISIS has wrought its brutality not only on the populations of Syria and Iraq, especially against ethnic minority groups, but also launched brutal attacks such as those in Paris, Brussels, Istanbul, and beyond. Our military and intelligence leaders continue to warn publicly about the potential for ISIS to resurge if they are given the opportunity, including Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley, who just last week made a public visit to northeast Syria. He highlighted the importance of finishing the job against ISIS and emphasized if we ignore and turn our back, then we're setting the conditions for a resurgence. Our presence also serves a critical advisory and assist role as the SDF continues to administer ISIS detainee facilities, including those holding experienced, highly trained ISIS fighters, as the United States, along with our coalition partners, work to safely and humanely repatriate them to their countries of origin. Pulling the plug now on this important mission jeopardizes the important work and support role that we play. Finally, while I share the co-sponsor of this legislation's passion for Congress reclaiming its war powers, I do not think this concurrent resolution is the proper vehicle for doing so. Last Congress, under my leadership as the House Foreign Affairs Committee, marked up repeals of 3 of the 4 existing AUMFs that's on the books. The full House passed each of these measures as well, but unfortunately they languished on the other side of the Capitol. We need to continue this work, and I look forward to working with Chairman McCall and the gentleman from Florida on these efforts. Congress must repeal outdated war authorizations once and for all, and I applaud the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for their bipartisan vote to repeal the 2002 and the 1991 AUMFs earlier today. So, we have important work to do. We should define hostilities in statute, not because it's an easy fix, but because it's a hard question that underpins key national security issues around the globe. And toughest of all, we must repeal the 2001 AUMF and replace it with a narrow force authorization that grants the President authority to combat select territories enumerated in countries where the United States national security is at stake. And I intend to introduce such an AUMF later this year. And I believe that the importance of combating ISIS in Syria should be on such an authorization, and this is part of why I oppose House Concurrent Resolution 21. So I encourage my colleagues to oppose this resolution, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Most Americans don't know a single Syrian. And so people watching this debate might wonder, how has it come to be that Syria has become the great platform of great power competition in the world? Begins in 2011 during the Arab Spring, when Assad, who is undeniably a madman and a despot, opens fire on his own people protesting. Then part of the Syrian army defects. They engage in warfare against Assad, and all of a sudden they got a whole lot of weapons and money being sent from the rich Gulf monarchies through Jordan into Syria. So Iran's not just going to watch this. Assad's their ally. They activate Hezbollah. They then invade Syria. So now you've got Jordan, the Gulf monarchies, Iran. But wait, Russia is pitching their vision of the world as a regime preservation force, whether you're Maduro or Assad. So they get involved, and what do they get for their time? A warm water port in the Eastern Mediterranean. So we've got Russia, the Gulf monarchies. Israel starts to get worried about Hezbollah and Iran. So Israel cuts a deal with Russia to keep Iran out of southern Syria. And if it doesn't get any worse than that, now all of a sudden you've got the Kurds who declare war on Syria. And it makes it a little messy that the Kurds are also in conflict with Turkey, which is a NATO ally. And then somehow the United States in 2015 says, you know what? We need to get involved in this mess in Syria. And since we have been there, we have seen Americans die. We have seen tens of billions of dollars wasted. And what is hilarious about the 2001 AUMF that the neoconservatives wave around like some permission slip for every neoconservative fantasy of turning an Arabian desert into a Jeffersonian democracy is that that very 2001 AUMF would justify attacking the people that we're fighting against and the people we're funding, because both have ties to al-Qaeda, and of course the 2001 AUMF dealt with al-Qaeda. All this talk about a reemergence of ISIS, I would encourage my colleagues to go read the Inspector General's report of the last quarter that indicates that ISIS is not a threat to the homeland. And with the Turks conducting operations in Syria against ISIS, with Assad and Russia having every incentive to create pressure on ISIS, I do not believe that what stands between a caliphate and not a caliphate are the 900 Americans who have been sent to this hellscape with no definition of victory, with no clear objective and purely existing as a vestige to the regime change, failed foreign policies of multiple former presidents. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield as much time as you may consume to the gentleman from Montana, Mr. Zinke.
The gentleman from Montana is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand before you today in strong opposition to Resolution 21 to pull forces out of Syria. Like many in this distinguished chamber, I've served in the region. I've spent 23 years as a Navy SEAL. I've hunted war criminals, I've dismantled terrorist cells, and I've fought for freedom on foreign shores. There are several self-evident truths in Syria. First, the U.S. troops are authorized by Congress. Second, as I do believe that we should review those authorizations, then they need to be reviewed. We should have answers on objectives, on failures, on victories, on a plan for ultimate success. I agree. But there is no doubt that Syria also remains a center for radical Islamic forces and terrorism, like ISIS, like PKK. These are organizations that will never stop, ever. They are committed to destroy this nation and our allies, and we should be aware of their objectives. Lastly, the hard truth is this: either we fight them in Syria or we'll fight them here. Either we fight and defeat them in Syria or we'll fight in the streets of our nation. And to understand the scope of the military presence, we're talking about 900 troops. That's 900 troops that have to have the capability for intelligence collection, self-defense, surveillance, targeting. In case our troops get in trouble, that force must be sufficient to get them out of trouble, because every sailor, soldier, airman, and Marine deserves nothing less. 300 military personnel is an objectively small contingent. When you look at it, that's about the size of a Walmart. So I agree with many of the supporters of the resolution that Congress has the powers, and these powers should be reviewed. We should ask the hard questions. What's the path to victory? Where are the resources that are being spent? Are they being spent in the right spot? Is there a clear path to victory, and what are the interests of the United States? But believe me, Mr. Chairman, I understand the burden of war. I've lost a lot of friends, and I understand the consequences of war on foreign shores, both to the servicemen and our families, which is why I call on my colleagues today to ask the right questions, but to reject this well-intended but really, really bad idea. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I'm glad to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York and the ranking member of the House Judiciary Committee, Representative Nadler.
Gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I rise in opposition to this resolution, and I want to associate myself with the remarks of the chairman and the ranking members of the Foreign Affairs Committee. For all those reasons, we cannot withdraw our 900 troops now because of what was said about ISIS. But in addition to that, we are defending the Kurds against certain slaughter at the hands of the Peshmerga if we were to withdraw our troops. The Turks, as we know, are supporting the Peshmerga. In addition to which, if we were to withdraw our troops, that increases the worry that Israel has to have about Iran, and that increases the odds of a conflict between Israel and Iran, which is the last thing the Middle East needs or the world needs. For all these reasons, I strongly urge this body to reject this resolution. It is true we should review all the AUMFs we have lying around. I didn't know we had one from 1991. But this resolution is the wrong vehicle, and it is productive of chaos and probably of slaughter. I therefore oppose it, and I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
My patriotic colleague, Mr. Zinke of Montana, gave up the game when he said ISIS will never be gone. So presumably the position of those holding that viewpoint is that we have to stay in Syria forever, maybe make it the 51st state. With that, I yield 1 minute to a member of the Homeland Security Committee and the House Oversight Committee, Ms. Green of Georgia.
Gentlewoman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you. I have the great privilege of serving with many veterans here in Congress, and to them I'm so grateful for their service. But this is also why I rise in support for this resolution to pull our great military from Syria. I'd like to point out on the official website for the U.S. Department of Defense, when it tells who the Department of Defense is on the About page, it says, "We are your defense." The Department of Defense is America's largest government agency, with our military tracing its roots back to pre-revolutionary times. The department has grown and evolved with our nation. Our mission is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and ensure our nation's security. That is the job of our Department of Defense, not to wage war in foreign lands and foreign countries at the expense of the American taxpayer, but it is to deter war. It is also the role of the Department of Defense to ensure our nation's security, but our border is being ignored. Every single day, our border is invaded by thousands, and over 300 Americans die daily from fentanyl brought into our country by Mexican cartels. I would say those are the enemies we need to be focusing on, not in a country called Syria, where no one in my district ever demands, "Marjorie, we must go to war in Syria." I never hear that request from anyone that voted for me. As a matter of fact, the veterans in my district say we are sick and tired of foreign wars. We are fed up with it, and too many of our American military have died in foreign lands serving their foreign borders and their foreign causes. So I'd like to thank my colleague Matt Gaetz for introducing this resolution, and I strongly encourage all of my colleagues to support it. Thank you.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield as much time as you may consume to the gentleman from South Carolina, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Mr. Wilson.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Chairman Mike McCall. I rise in opposition to House Concurrent Resolution 21. Stopping the resurgence of ISIS now, before more attacks on American families, is critical. My appreciation of military service is a 31-year Army veteran myself, but I'm particularly grateful that I've had 4 sons: Alan, who served in Iraq; Addison, who served in Iraq; Julian, who served in Egypt; and my youngest son, Hunter, an engineer in Afghanistan. So I know personally the significance of military service, and gosh, I think of the last 20 years that our military, because of the 9/11, we have stopped attacks in the United States, and so this strength must be maintained. At the height of ISIS' reign of terror, Operation Inherent Resolve was formally launched in October 2015 to counter the terrorist network's rapid expansion in Iraq and Syria. Upon the defeat of the physical caliphate in Baghouz in 2019, the United States conducted a drawdown of forces. Currently, there are approximately 900 U.S. soldiers in northeast Syria. The remaining troops assist the Syrian Democratic Forces in deterrence of continued terrorist threats from Iranian-backed terrorist organizations and maintenance of facilities containing, amazing, this is incredible, the American people need to know, 10,000 hardened ISIS prisoners who are dedicated and trained mass murderers, along with thousands of their radicalized family members. While the American-led coalition was successful, the threat of ISIS and the extremism in the region remain. Reporting indicates that ISIS is making significant efforts to reorganize in Syria and Iraq. Iranian-backed terrorists who back up the murderous regime of Bashar al-Assad also continue attacks on U.S. forces at Al-Tanf and pose a tremendous destabilizing effect. Upon withdrawal, terrorists would also have unfettered access to the Omar oil field. A full withdrawal of the efficient forces remaining would completely open the region to the resurgence of ISIS and other terrorist organizations whose mission is the destruction of American families. Such a threat to American national security would warrant intervention. Uprooting the small contingent of troops who have successfully maintained order to the extent possible would simply ensure that we would be returning to a much larger, more complex problem at a higher cost and threat to Americans worldwide. The resolution, we know, is well intended, but deterrence is cheaper and more effective than facilitating a full-scale response after the fact. We don't need to repeat 9/11. Peace is best maintained through strength. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
And I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Colorado, Representative Crow.
Gentleman from Colorado is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Meeks. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in opposition to House Concurrent Resolution 21. Now, I have been one of the most vocal proponents in this Congress on reasserting congressional authority in matters of war and peace, because the Congress delegates to this body the decision to debate and decide when to send our men and women into harm's way. Now, Congress after Congress has abdicated that authority to both Republican and Democratic administrations. And yes, it is time to pull it back. And it is time to reassert our authority and to have the debates that have been long overdue for many, many years. And I join my bipartisan colleagues in that endeavor because it is a right, true, and just endeavor, and we owe our constituents nothing less. But there is a good way to do it, and there is a wrong way to do it. And I rise in opposition to this concurrent resolution because it is the wrong way to do it for 3 reasons. Many of us have spent the morning in the Foreign Affairs Committee rehashing the disaster of their 20 years in Afghanistan and hearing about the moral stain of our partners and allies that we have left behind in Afghanistan. I am not willing to make that mistake again of saying that we will leave behind the Kurds and the Syrian Democratic Forces and our other partners who have fought side by side with us in years past and again today. Number 2, the dangers that ISIS poses to the American people is well documented, and we are not prepared yet to abdicate and turn our back on that threat. And number 3, any military person knows that retrograde operations or withdrawal operations are the riskiest operations that you can conduct. And setting an arbitrary timeline on a retrograde that is not tied to defined benchmarks or operational requirements is the wrong way to do it and puts our men and women at risk. I urge my colleagues to oppose this measure, and I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Before yielding to my colleague, I would observe that we've done a lot for the Kurds, $1.5 billion. We can love the Kurds, but it's not a marriage. It is not until death do we part. And it seems as though the Kurds have made book with Assad and that would provide a structure for them to continue to exist. With that, Mr. Speaker, I would yield 4 minutes to a patriotic American who served in our military, served in Iraq and Syria, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and my colleague from Florida, Mr. Mills.
Is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The 2001 and 2002 authorization for use of military force licensed the executive branch to conduct broad military operations, and Congress has disregarded its constitutional oversight powers as a result. Repealing these outdated AUMFs restores Congress's constitutional checks on the executive fiat. The United States military forces are present in the Middle East pursuant to an authorization for use of military force that was enacted more than 20 years ago. At that time, Congress did not conceive that these authorizations would sanction an endless military commitment. The United States is not the world's policeman, and it is incredibly unwise to promote this level of involvement in international disputes. However, Democrat and Republican presidents alike have abused the powers of war granted under the 01 and 02 AUMFs, and Congress must act to rein back the executive branch's war authorities. Further, continuing to dump trillions of dollars into these endless wars is irresponsible, runs contrary to American economic and security interests, and unnecessarily places American lives in jeopardy. It is clear that the basis for the AUMFs currently in force have long expired, and Congress must fulfill its constitutional responsibilities and ensure that we are conducting proper oversight of the executive branch and the military operations. Now, I hear my colleagues on the left talking about leaving the Kurds and withdrawals, but yet I note that these are the exact same individuals that their party argues that it was time to withdraw from Afghanistan and leave our allies and Americans behind, something I know about since I am the only member of Congress who actually conducted the first overland rescue of Americans out of Afghanistan after they were left behind. I will also note that this is the same people saying that pulling away is going to increase ISIS's presence. Is this not the exact same government that said that nation building was a great strategy for Iraq? Is this not the same government who utilized and helped to implement the 2005 Iraq Constitution that implemented Article 76 that sets forth sectarian democracy, giving rise to Iran's political stronghold? I have spent 7 years of my life in Iraq, over almost 3 years in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Pakistan, northern Somalia. Been blown up twice in 2006. I'm a Bronze Star recipient and proud combat veteran. I can tell you that the 20-plus years that we served in Iraq and Afghanistan, had it been a counterterrorism operation or counterinsurgency strategy, I could fully have gotten behind that. But we continue to play political football, and that's exactly what the dangers of these AUMFs are. They allow people to basically do carte blanche with warfare, and that is not the intent. In fact, I would argue that we have already lost the advantage, and we should be refocusing our efforts on what is happening on our southern border, where just a day ago we had 2 Americans who was killed by what I would consider to be a worthy adversary, which is the cartels. So we sit here today, and I'm not going to talk about the arguments of the $86 billion that we left behind when we talk about the ISIS buildup. Let's talk about the ISIS buildup. What about ISIS Khorasan? What about Haqqani Network? What about the Taliban, who has $86 billion in weapons, armament, defense products, millions of dollars of pallets of cash? They are now the closest to being a true caliph with an actual sovereignty in its borders and a recognized government. That is who we need to be concerned with. Because when I went to Afghanistan, I thought it was to help to fight from this becoming a safe haven of terrorism. And instead, we have actually promoted, funded, trained, and actually made it a safe haven of terrorism. The American people is not about endless wars. The American people is about us being involved in things that we have control over. And unfortunately, due to the political football and the fact that it was the suits, not the boots, making the decisions, we have no clear military objective, and that is why this has continued to be a failure. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me just say to my colleague who serves with me on the Foreign Affairs Committee, we have a lot in agreement. I think the 2001 AUMF is outdated, and it should have been sunsetted, and Congress has a constitutional responsibility to address this. And now as chairman, that is my intention, and I hope to work with the gentleman on this. But the point, this is a privileged resolution under the War Powers Act 5C, Section C, that basically just says if U.S. forces are engaged in hostilities without authorization, such forces shall be removed by the president if directed by a congressional concurrent resolution. We have authorization here, and it's the 2001 AUMF. We may not like that. We can debate whether we need to update this thing. I think we do. And the ranking member and I have had these discussions as well. But that is really the centerpiece of what we're talking about on this privileged resolution. So, when this is all said and done, I hope we can perhaps work on updating this outdated authorized use of military force to what is the modern day threat. So with that, I yield as much time as you may consume to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Lawler.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And before I begin, I want to acknowledge and thank my colleague, the gentleman from Florida, for his service and for his insights, I think, which are invaluable to our committee and the work that we're doing. So thank you to him. I rise in opposition to H-Con Res 21, which would remove the United States Armed Forces from Syria. And while the situation in the Middle East remains complicated and volatile, we must not forget the critical role that the United States plays in furthering peace and combating international terrorism in the region. And as the chairman just pointed out, the use of military force is authorized under the 2001 agreement. And so we must fulfill our obligations in rooting out al-Qaeda and its direct successors in ISIS. As a resident of New York who was in his 5th day of freshman year of high school on September 11th, I will never forget the events of those days, that day, and what occurred and the aftermath of it. And our obligation to combat and confront terrorism wherever it rears its head. ISIS may no longer hold territory, but they are still a threat. And they were responsible for 72 terrorist attacks in Iraq and Syria in the last quarter of 2022 alone. And just last month, U.S. forces killed a senior ISIS leader in Syria. ISIS once held territory the size of Great Britain, but thanks to our ongoing efforts, it no longer does. A complete withdrawal of U.S. forces, however, will have the same disastrous consequences as our rapid withdrawal from Afghanistan, a topic on which our committee is holding a hearing today. Without U.S. forces in Syria, our enemies will return, they will regrow, and they will come after our allies, and potentially the United States. And while I appreciate and support the desire to prevent any further loss of American life and limb, there is no doubt in my mind that if we let international terrorist groups run rampant in Syria and throughout the Middle East, especially in the wake of a devastating natural disaster that the country just experienced, we are abdicating our responsibility to keep the American people safe from harm. And not only that, by maintaining our troop presence in Syria, we can continue to support our allies in the region and work towards a more stable and peaceful Middle East, including supporting and growing the Abraham Accords. Of course, we must always prioritize the safety and well-being of our military personnel, and any decision to maintain troop presence in Syria must be carefully considered and strategically planned. The Biden administration must be cognizant of this fact and not allow our troop presence in Syria to go the way of the disastrous Afghanistan withdrawal. I agree with my colleagues about the need to reevaluate and to look at the AUMF and reform the process and move forward, but we need to do so in a deliberative manner. This is not the way to go about it, and for those reasons, I cannot in good conscience support this. And so it is my hope that this body will reject this resolution and allow our committee to do the work it needs to do to reform this process. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from the great state of Massachusetts, Representative Seth Moulton.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is yielded 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, the safety and security of the United States over 21 years since 9/11 is no accident. It's due to the sweat, toil, and blood of thousands of young Americans. Now, many Americans have purely enjoyed the fruits of this labor with not contributing anything to the cost. But as a veteran of the war on terror myself, I stand here today, and from the bottom of my heart, I genuinely wish I could tell you, Mr. Speaker, I could tell my colleagues, mission accomplished, we can go home. I truly wish I could say that. But the mission is not accomplished yet. It is not finished. There is still work to do, which our troops in Syria carry on today. Because ISIS remains the deadliest terrorist threat in the world. And the work that these troops do, day in and day out, is a relatively small investment in our security and the security of our allies.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Yield another 30 seconds.
Gentleman has yielded another 30 seconds.
Now, I share the general consensus that we should re-debate the AUMF. That's Congress's job. And I have voted, in fact, for measures similar to this in past that will force that debate. We should force Congress to debate the AUMF, but we should not force our troops to withdraw. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Republicans and Democrats alike have been citing the 2001 AUMF. It's important to note there are Americans fighting in Syria today that were not born when the 2001 AUMF was approved. About 9 out of every 10 of us in the House of Representatives weren't even here to vote on it. With that, I yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Gentleman from Arizona is yielded 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Florida for sponsoring this legislation. You know, there is no legal authority for the U.S. to be involved in the Syrian civil war. There is no authority. Section 5C of the War Powers Act does not say, and I'm quoting the chairman now, it does not say without authorization. That's not the language. The language says specific statutory authority. Either declare war or you have specific statutory authority. And you know what that 2001 AUMF says? It says those who aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001. It doesn't say ISIS. It doesn't say Syria. It's talking about the events of 2001, as the gentleman from Florida just referenced. It's a quaint idea. It's a quaint idea to say, well, we're going to rely on that 2001 AUMF. I thought they were going to say they were going to relying on the 2002 AUMF. But either way, neither one works. You don't have authority, and you're going to be there and put U.S. soldiers in harm's way. This is a civil war. One Syrian analyst said this recently, quote, "Until we see the externals confront each other directly rather than on the Syrian ground, I don't see an actual end to the Syrian conflict," close quote. You know who the externals are? The U.S., Russia, Iran. That's the externals. And we have no authority to be one of those externals. And that analyst went on to say, it's a proxy war. And that's what's happening. It's another U.S.-Russia proxy war. When the Syrian civil war began with protests during the Arab Spring of 2011, U.S. President Obama then said, he went to the regime in Syria and he said, quote, "The future of Syria must be determined by its people, but President Bashar al-Assad is standing in the way. For the sake of the Syrian people, the time has come for President Assad to step aside," close quote. Is that our objective? Regime change? Is that what it is? No, we don't know. We don't know what the objective is. You can't even define what the exit ramp is. Assad responded at that time by fueling the civil war, the exacerbation of that problem, and it has just grown. And now you've got us with our allies, the Turks, and our allies, the Kurds. They're fighting against each other. They don't want each other. But ISIS in 2019 was declared to be defeated. Even the Inspector General recently said they don't have an ability to cause damage and fear and harm in the homeland. And the result is in the last 13 years, the U.S. has spent more than $15 billion on humanitarian aid, and we don't even know what we've spent in Department of Defense costs. You know why? Because they're grouping it with what's going on in Iraq. We tried to obtain information. Well, how much have we spent? Well, nobody will tell us. When General Milley says, and by the way, he was the architect of that disastrous Afghanistan retreat, and he's a believer in however long, no matter the cost approach in Ukraine, he insists we prolong our involvement in the civil war in Syria in order to help our allies. General Milley, who's our allies? Is it the Kurds? Is it the Turks? Who is it? Is it the Assad regime? He can't tell you. No one can tell you. All of this is being done, though, without legal authority. It's time for us to stop fighting proxy wars. It's time for us not to say, "Oh, next time we'll take care of these AUMFs." We've had time after time. This is the time to get rid of them. I urge us to vote for this. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Yeah, I'm proud to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Virginia, Representative Spanberger.
Gentlewoman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand here today as a member of Congress who has proudly worked to fight and defeat terrorism as a CIA officer. And I worked with my colleagues to protect the lives of the American people, our service members, and our interests around the world. And I fully agree that we need to revisit our authorizations of the use of military force. And I have worked with members of Congress, including the esteemed gentleman from Florida, to raise this issue. And I am proud to see that we are actually seeing progress towards the repeal of the 1991 and 2002 AUMFs. That's encouraging. However, that does not mean that we should abandon ongoing operations that keep the United States safe that are authorized under the 2001 AUMF. Should we discuss it? Should we debate it? Should we look towards reforming it? Perhaps. Should we order the men and women in uniform to come home over the next few months? Absolutely not. We should not encourage a resurgence of ISIS. We should not abandon our work with the Kurdish fighters on the front lines. And we should understand the implications for the long-term stability of the Middle East of the actions we take here today. And for these reasons, I oppose the resolution to withdraw quickly from Syria. And I look forward to earnest, bipartisan, forward-looking conversations about how we can reassert our constitutional role and protect our ongoing work to defeat terrorism and keep the homeland safe. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Syria is such a mess. We are sometimes funding both sides in the same battle. I seek unanimous consent to introduce into the record LA Times piece entitled, "In Syria, Militias Armed by the Pentagon Fight Those Armed by the CIA."
So ordered.
With that, I yield 2 minutes to a veteran, also a military spouse of one of our brave patriots who fought in Syria, my colleague from Florida, Ms. Luna.
Gentlewoman from Florida is yielded 2 minutes.
Thank you. I just want to start out by saying ISIS has been destroyed. A few hundred troops will not stop the next terrorist.com, and that's never going to end. And I'm frankly tired of hearing the sentiment on both sides that if we do not fight them there, they will come here. There are way too many countries to apply that logic. And if we are so concerned, then why is a majority of the U.S. government stagnant on the southern border where it matters? Terrorists are literally walking in. Or better yet, if that's a true concern, then why did we leave billions of dollars in equipment during a botched withdrawal in Afghanistan? Do you really think terrorist.coms aren't going to use that equipment like ISIS did? Peace is accomplished through superior firepower, strong leadership, and a plan, not blunders of failed foreign policy literally repeating itself. We have zero strategic advantage and zero reason to be in Syria. In fact, they don't even want us there. Al-Assad and Putin are tight, and if you actually check out some of Russia's naval warships, they're actually hanging out in the western port of Syria. What we need to be focusing on is bigger issues like China. Syria is a very dangerous place for us to be leaving a few hundred Americans. We are better off sending those troops on JSATs to places like South America, where we can build stronger and useful allies who will actually work with us. Make no mistake, if we take China at their word, a near-peer fight is coming, and it will require 100% of our military and more than the American people are going to pay for it. And that is why I support this resolution. And if I can also add to those of my colleagues that had mentioned the Kurds, our NATO ally, Turkey, who is not the best NATO ally, might I add, has deemed them a terrorist organization. And after the takeback of Mosul, we actually turned our back on them after promising to recognize them as a nation at the United Nations. Thank you. I yield my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Texas, Representative Sheila Jackson Lee.
Gentlewoman from Texas is yielded 1 minute.
Well, first of all, let me thank the ranking member of the committee and the chairman of the committee. Let me thank my colleague from the Judiciary Committee, the gentleman from Florida, because this is a thoughtful initiative dealing with the question that Congress must confront, and that is the AUMF in its totality. We've had it since 2001 and beyond, and I believe that is an important discussion. I'd like to distinguish, however, what I think is an area that does not warrant the removal of our troops, 900 of them. It is a tough area. It is an area in Syria where if you talk to Syrian Americans, they want the people of Syria to be protected. In my meetings with the president of Syria so many years ago, I had hoped for a new vision for Syria. I hoped for an ally with Syrians. Syrian Americans want democracy. But in this instance, we are on the border, a very tough location, and I have to look at the humanitarian question. I have to look at the issue of the protection of women and children, as well as the Kurds. The Kurds have no one but us, and the opposition has a strong ally as well.
So another 30 seconds.
Gentlewoman has yielded 30 seconds.
So I would recognize the fact that we all want peace. But in this instance, also in the midst of the crisis of the earthquake, you knew that the stories and heard the stories that the Syrians in that area were not getting help because of the conflict and fighting. That's tragic, that we allow people to be desperate and need humanitarian aid because they cannot get the protection they need. It is important for the stability of that area, for the protection of women and children, and to save lives, that at this time we do not withdraw our troops. I ask my colleagues to oppose the underlying legislation and to respect the gentleman for the discussion that I think we should have. I yield back.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire as to my remaining time?
The gentleman has 5 minutes remaining.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York.
I continue to reserve.
Gentleman from Texas continues to reserve. Gentleman from New York.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from Florida, you're recognized.
I would ask my colleagues how many remaining speakers they have, and are they prepared to close?
Gentleman from Texas has 2 minutes. Gentleman from New York has 7.5 minutes. And you, sir, gentleman from Florida has 5 minutes.
Is the gentleman prepared to close? So I'll reserve then.
Florida. Gentleman from Florida would close first.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. Much of the discussion today has revolved around whether or not withdrawing from Syria will ignite some new ISIS caliphate. We've pointed out time and again Inspector General's reports saying that that is unlikely. But I'm not entirely sure that us having troops in Syria deters ISIS more than it is a recruiting tool for ISIS. Moreover, President Trump said that if Russia wanted to kill ISIS, we should let them. And I think there is wisdom in that. Both Assad and Turkey are in stronger positions today to put downward pressure on ISIS. And maybe if we weren't giving weapons to people shooting at Assad, Assad would have every incentive to be able to engage ISIS in a way to ensure that it doesn't come back. And we have to also acknowledge Syria and Iraq are the two countries on the planet Earth where we have done the most to fund ISIS. We give weapons to these so-called moderate rebels, which I actually thought was an oxymoron, and it turns out they're not that moderate. Sometimes the rebels we fund to go fight Assad turn around and raise the ISIS flag, and so it's quite silly to be saying we have to withdraw to stop ISIS when it is our very presence in Syria, in some cases, that has been the best gift to ISIS. There are groups like al-Nusra and associated entities that are like our frenemies when they're in Syria, and then they cross over the border into Iraq and they become full-fledged jihadists posing a so-called threat to the homeland. There are 1,500 different groups in Syria. So today's friend is tomorrow's ISIS. And there's no real clear delineation as to what the enduring defeat of ISIS means. Like, do we have to keep 900 Americans in Syria until the last heartbeat stops of the last person who holds some sympathy for ISIS? I would certainly hope not. It would mean we would have to be there forever. Israel has made their deal with Russia to be protected. The Kurds have made their peace with Assad to be protected. And what we see among this quagmire is there's really not a role for the United States of America in Syria. We are not a Middle Eastern power. We have tried this time and again to build a democracy out of sand and blood and Arab militias, and time and again, the work we do does not reduce chaos. Oftentimes, it causes chaos. the very chaos that then subsequently leads to terrorism. My colleagues, my staff who've served in Syria, my constituents tell me that often these anti-ISIS raids are just raids of local thugs and drug dealers who have some cousin that's in ISIS, and it is not appropriate to put Americans at risk. Often our Americans are guarding these oil fields where the Iranians are sending kamikaze drones, and I am shocked that we have not had escalatory accident or even more casualties for our U.S. service members. And so if this is all one big Georgetown School of Foreign Service essay exam about great power competition in Syria, you go tell that to the parents of the Americans who have to sleep tonight in Syria, who have to guard oil fields with Iranian drones coming at them, that they're necessary to preserve the balance of power. That is not true. The Kurds have an opportunity to pave their path. Let's pave ours. And if we're so worried about threats to the homeland, how about we actually focus on our true point of vulnerability, which is not the emergence of some caliphate. It's the fact that terrorists are crossing our southern border on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. We seem far less concerned about that, and we undeniably should be. My colleagues, I ask you to support this resolution, to reassert Congress's power to speak on these matters of war and peace. So often we come to the floor and we debate frivolities. This is one of the most important things we can be talking about. How we use the credibility of our fellow Americans, how we spend America's treasure, how we spill the blood of our bravest patriots. We have stained the deserts in the Middle East with enough American blood. It is time to bring our service members home. I encourage my colleagues to support the resolution and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
There's one thing that is clear from this debate that I think that we all can agree upon. We need to debate and look at AUMFs, and that Congress must assert its authority that the Constitution has given us. I think that that is something that we can all agree and work together on. Chairman McCall and myself had these conversations last year, last Congress, and we'll continue to have them on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, I'm sure, because it is important. And for me, the toughest votes that I've had as a member of Congress is to determine whether or not we should send our women and men into combat. So I should not, though, because it's a tough vote, yield that to anyone, because it is my responsibility and our responsibility as members of Congress to make that decision. But I again call on members to oppose this measure as such a forced, premature end to our presence and joint efforts in northeast Syria. Because this not only threatens to give ISIS an opportunity to resurge and again use Syria as a launch pad for attacks throughout the region and beyond, but it also leaves our Syrian partners out to dry. Any withdrawal of U.S. forces must be done in close coordination with our coalition allies and partners, because our courageous Syrian opposition friends need to be a part of this, and we need to talk to them, and in a manner that ensures our national security. So I hope my colleagues will join me as I oppose this resolution and look forward to a future debate on AUMF issues. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Speaker. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Let me just say, it's been a good debate. I mean, these are issues of war and peace, nothing more important in this body than what we've been talking about today. You know, I was a counterterrorism federal prosecutor after 9/11, chairman of the Homeland Security Committee when the ISIS and the Caliphate was at its strength with external operations. And yes, the southern border and the threat that that proposes. But I just want to, you know, and we can talk about the merits some more. And I appreciate this discussion, but at the heart of this under the War Powers Resolution privileged is, and I'm quoting directly, United States Armed Forces are engaged in hostilities without a declaration of war or specific statutory authorization. Such forces shall be removed by the President if Congress so directs. The authority's there. And if you look under the AUMF of 2001, to prevent any future acts of international terrorism, I want to close with President Trump. And I was a part of this decision with him on June 9, 2020. He says, since October 7, 2001, United States Armed Forces have conducted counterterrorism operations against al-Qaeda. Since August of 2014, they've been targeted at the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, otherwise known as ISIS, formerly known as al-Qaeda in Iraq. These ongoing operations have been successful in seriously degrading ISIS capabilities in Syria and Iraq. If we want to start having a debate about repealing and replacing the 2001 AUMF, I would just argue to my colleagues that that would be the productive route to fix this issue of whether the United States should be present in the Middle East at all. And to close our Afghanistan hearing, what a mess we've left behind and what a threat that has become as well. I urge my colleagues to oppose this, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. All time for debate has expired.